Hi everyone. So this video is going to be about the central question of the prolegomena to any future metaphysics. And that question is, sorry, the glare is kind of bad here. It's just, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? So that might sound like a lot of jargon, but it gets at a really deep philosophical question. And so the purpose of this video is to get us to try to understand the nature of that question. And basically the way that we're going to do that is we're going to break up what Kant is saying into multiple parts, right? So we need to figure out what it is to have a synthetic judgment, right? And we need to figure out what it is to have an a priori judgment. So I have a little chart here, and we're going to focus on that for now. On the left-hand side, I have distinguished analytic and synthetic kinds of judgments. So you might think about the root words for analytic and synthetic, which are analysis and synthesis, right? An analysis is a breaking of something apart into its parts, right? And so analytic truths are the sort of truths that Leibniz said can be resolved into identities. In other words, whenever we have an analytic proposition or an analytic judgment, we're not actually expanding our knowledge, right? We're simply getting into an analysis of what's already included in the subject. So just as an example, so this one is a priori because we can know this fact independently of any and all experience, right? Whereas a posteriori refers to after experience, right? So analytic judgments are going to be judgments like definitions, right? So the classic example is all bachelors are unmarried men. So the point is that this definition is going to hold true. You can know of any and all bachelors in the universe, regardless of the empirical facts about the universe, that they are unmarried men. Why can you know that? Because they're bachelors, right? So in other words, the concept bachelor contains being an unmarried man already. So you can already know, namely, that all bachelors are unmarried men. And so you can know this universally, you can know this of all bachelors, right? And you can know this necessarily, right? Because it's going to hold true of any and all bachelors whatsoever. A priori judgments are going to be characterized by universality and necessity. In other words, whenever we make an a priori judgment, it has to be that way. And in virtue of the fact that it has to be that way, it will be that way in every circumstance, right? Whereas a posteriori judgments, these only justify inductive inferences. So whenever we say, because something in the past happened, we can infer that something is going to happen again in the future, right? And so importantly, there's no such thing as an analytic a posteriori judgment. Why? Because we don't learn from experience how to use words, right? The definitions of words, that's something that we learn in our education, right? But they're not proven or disproven by our experience, right? They're just the way that we use those words. So there's no analytic a posteriori, because if, in the case of being an unmarried man is a part of being a bachelor, right, then we can never discover something that would disprove that. We can never have empirical evidence about definitions. That's just not really how that works, right? So now we have to move to synthetic kinds of judgments. And so synthetic judgments are characterized by the fact that they're an expansion of our knowledge, right? Analytic judgments just sort of took something, the subject of a judgment, a bachelor, right? And then examined some of its predicates, right? Namely that they're an unmarried man, right? And so in that way, unmarried man is already contained in bachelor, right? So we're not getting anything new. Now, so we can also then talk about synthetic judgments. So it's judgments that genuinely add things to our knowledge. And it's very easy to understand how experience does that, right? And here our paradigmatic example is just empirical science, right? So if I want to expand my knowledge of the world, well, how do I go about doing that? Well, I have more experiences, right? Or I draw on the experiences of others, right? And I engage in sort of empirical scientific inquiry, right? So that is synthetic a posteriori judgments. So judgments that expand our knowledge that come from experience. That's like empirical science. Now, the trickiest category, so before I get into that, actually, one thing that you might notice is that analytic a priori judgments are what Hume called relations of ideas, right? Because these definitions are just about the way that we understand words, right? And so they're relations about our ideas, namely that bachelor contains unmarried man, right? Now, synthetic a posteriori judgments roughly conform to what Hume called matters of fact, right? Because these are contingent facts, they could have been otherwise, that we learn from experience, and so only have sort of like a probabilistic conclusion. So the most interesting and difficult category is synthetic a priori judgments. And so these are kinds of judgments that genuinely expand our knowledge, but that exhibit the universality and necessity of a priori judgments. One way that you might interpret Hume, the way that Kant interpreted Hume, is as denying that it was possible to have synthetic a priori judgments, right? Why is this the case? Well, Hume characterized mathematics as a kind of relation between ideas, right? And similarly, Hume characterized physics as just a kind of empirical science, right? And so for Hume, the only thing that went into this box of synthetic a priori judgments was metaphysics, right? And so Hume was very happy to say, synthetic a priori judgments, they're fake, right? They don't exist, they are unjustified, they are only sort of the spooky domain of metaphysics and similar superstitions, right? And this is how Hume sort of interprets metaphysics, right? And how Hume's fork works is that Hume says that all kinds of knowledge are, rephrased in Kantian terminology. Analytic a priori judgments, so about our concepts, they don't expand our knowledge at all. Or they're synthetic and they come from experience, right? So the only source of the expansion of our knowledge is in a posteriori judgments. Now, okay, so why is it that instead of putting mathematics up as an analytic kind of judgment, that Kant instead says it's a synthetic kind of judgment? And similarly, why does Kant say that certain judgments in physics are actually a priori, right, rather than a posteriori? Well, Kant's examples are quite simple, right? Kant gives two examples of mathematical judgments that he thinks clearly demonstrate that they are synthetic, right? One corresponds to arithmetic, and this is 5 plus 7 equals 12. And you could, do 2 plus 2 equals 4 or whatever other arithmetic judgment. Now, so the reason why Kant says that this sort of judgment is synthetic is because it's not as if the concept of 12 included the concepts of 5 and 7, right? When we do mathematics, we're genuinely expanding our knowledge, right? We're not just sort of like creating an artificial language that has no correspondence with reality, right? We believe that we're justified in the application of mathematical principles to experience, right? And so we not only think that we're learning stuff about like I don't think it's just the case that like the way that I use the number 2, then 2 plus 2 equals 4, right? My knowledge of that sort of mathematical proposition is actually unconditioned, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4, not just for me, but for any entity that exists in the universe, right? It's not a judgment about me and how I make judgment. It's a judgment about the nature of mathematical truths, right? And why these mathematical truths hold in a universal and a necessary way, right? So, for Kant, this is the first arithmetic example of why mathematical judgments are synthetic a priori, is because even when we do arithmetic, we are expanding our knowledge, right? That arithmetic judgments have the possibility of expanding our knowledge is easily evident from the fact that I don't know what 5,702 multiplied by 8 is, right? I don't know that. It's not already contained in the kind of knowledge that I have, right? So discovering the answer to that question would be a genuine expansion of my knowledge, right? But the geometrical example that Kant uses as well is that a straight line is the shortest distance between 2 points, right? In this case, this is an analytic judgment, right? Because it's not like the notion of a straight line includes being the shortest between 2 points. This is instead like a point that we can demonstrate using geometric examples, right? And so it's not a fact about us or a fact about how we use concepts, right? It's a fact about how space works and how space is organized, right? And so in this case, it's even more obvious why this sort of judgment would be an expansion of our knowledge. Like it's genuinely meaningful, right? Whether a straight line is the shortest distance between points, right? And the fact that it is true, and that it's true in a universal, in a necessary way, is something that's quite interesting, right? Quite important. Now, you might think that Hume was right, though, to say that physics is an empirical science, right? It's something that's justified by a posteriori principles, right? But what Kant has in mind, right, are the sort of universal principles of physics that were given by, like, Newton, for example. That there's a conservation of matter and energy in the universe, right? This isn't something really that we discover empirically. It is something more like a guideline that we use when doing physical investigations. In other words, like it's not something that I discover in the course of doing physics, right? It's instead something that I have to assume for modern physics to even be intelligible, right? To even work as a system, right? And this is why Kant does not believe that these are a posteriori judgments, right? Is because they actually inform my anticipation of the fact that I can do empirical inquiry, right? So think about this, for example. If we didn't think that all events were causally related to one another, or at least subject to causal relations, then it would not be possible to do physics, right? Then we wouldn't be justified in trying to investigate the causes of, phenomena, right? And so ultimately, Kant argues physics employs certain principles, right? He's going to call them regulative principles for engaging in a genuinely scientific inquiry, right? And these are whenever you get the broadest, sort of requirements for doing inquiry into physical systems. So for Kant, the reason why Kant says that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber is because on the one hand he held the Leibnizian belief that mathematics and physics are governed by a priori principles, right? And so to give up on the idea of synthetic a priori principles is tantamount to getting rid of the fundamental principles of mathematics and physics itself, right? And so in this way, Kant, like Leibniz, sort of wants to draw a connection between mathematics, physics, and metaphysics, right? Then in each of these, it seems like we need to employ synthetic a priori judgments. Now the problem is that while mathematics and physics have made great strides forward, right, in the modern period, you have Descartes, you have the discovery of calculus, right? You have Newton, Bacon, Copernicus, Galileo, right? You have these amazing strides in physics and mathematics that seem possible primarily because they are able to use these synthetic a priori principles, right? And yet, the sort of sister science of mathematics and physics, metaphysics, is in complete disarray, right? Seemingly because there's no way to understand how it utilizes synthetic a priori judgments. So Kant's question, how are synthetic a priori judgments possible, is Kant is trying to discover the source of the legitimacy of the application of a priori principles that is clearly justified in the case of mathematics and physics, and why in the case of metaphysics it seems that things go wrong, that it's not able to formulate a science. And ultimately, what Kant is going to say, and what we're going to discuss more in the next video, is just ultimately that the reason why mathematics and physics can make synthetic a priori judgments with some degree of legitimacy, whereas systems of metaphysics, at least the kind that Kant was examining, fail this test, is because mathematics and physics ask questions about possible experience. So it's not asking about actual experience. It's not an a posteriori principle, right? But it's talking about possible experience, right? So what Kant is sort of trying to say, and what we're going to spend the next couple weeks trying to understand, is that mathematics and physics can justify using synthetic a priori principles because it can determine its applicability to our experience, right? If the math works out a certain way, then this should have demonstrable effects in my experience, right? And case in point is astronomy, right? Whenever we are examining the movements of the planets and the stars, right, we can mathematically assess and determine the movements of those planets, right? And then I can confirm them via my experience, right? But similarly, in physics, the conservation of matter and energy and other similar fundamental laws of physics those also have a correlate in my experience, right? They're sort of demonstrable. They're models that we can utilize. Whereas metaphysics, as we're going to see, seems like it has some sort of principles that seem justified, right? Because they seem to have a very tight relationship to physics, right? Namely that every event, is subject to causal relations, right? That seems like a metaphysical point that is intimately tied with physics, right? But then it also seems like metaphysics asks other questions, right, about the nature of God, for example, that are fundamentally outside of the domain of any experience I could have. And Kant says, ultimately, this is where sort of metaphysics goes wrong. So this is the sense of the question: how are synthetic a priori judgments possible? And hopefully you can see why it is that Kant said that Hume awoke him from his dogmatic slumber, right? What Kant means is that if Hume's skepticism is right, namely that all we have are relations of ideas or analytic a priori judgments and matters of fact, or synthetic a posteriori judgments, then we are left completely unable to explain the developments in mathematics and physics during this period. And so for Kant, Hume's skepticism goes too far, right? It ultimately makes mysterious the very real accomplishments and strides that the modern period made in its use of synthetic a priori principles in mathematics and physics. So in other words, Kant wants to take the insights of Hume, right? He wants to show that Hume is right in saying that at least a certain species or kind of metaphysics employs judgments that there's no way that it could possibly justify, right? But that Hume's own skepticism must be too sweeping, right? Because it includes skepticism about things that we can be pretty certain about, right? Like developments in mathematics and physics, right? So Kant is trying to give everyone their proper due, right? He wants to acknowledge the strides and accomplishments that we've made in mathematics and in physics, right? While also questioning those very same principles whenever they are used for the purposes of metaphysics, right? And so ultimately Kant is going to have a very nuanced position that argues that some metaphysical principles are justified while others are not. Okay, so this is probably going to be a third video for this series explaining what Kant's transcendental idealism is. And so I hope this video was helpful.